Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always for the GSMC Sports Network. Now, before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you, as always, that if you want to contribute and interact with our shows a little bit more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube, as well as our website, gsmcpodcast.net, for more ways to get your input, feedback and opinions on air, so we can discuss a little bit more and be more interactive with our shows. It is genuinely appreciated by all concerned, as well as any tips and donations you might consider leaving as well. But it just makes our shows that much better when you, our faithful audience, are contributing as well. Without further ado, let's jump right into our second off-season guide of this episode, talking about another AFC playoff participant, this one coming up just a little bit short against the aforementioned Buffalo Bills, the Baltimore Ravens. Now, this Baltimore Ravens team could very well have been the favorite to make it to the Super Bowl for a lot of people from the AFC this year. After all, the offense looked a lot more balanced with the addition of Derrick Henry, and the defense, while it had its struggles early in the season, really ramped it up over the last couple of weeks of the regular season and into the postseason as well, especially in their wild card matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers. And then everything unraveled in terms of offensive inconsistencies in that divisional round game against Buffalo, and they ultimately came up short. But I do think that if you're the Baltimore Ravens, you should not necessarily feel too hard done by this season, because you saw a lot of major improvements from this offense, but also a lot of inconsistencies as well that I feel like you can address pretty aptly in the offseason if you're Baltimore. So without further ado, let's jump right into how Baltimore can really bolster their squad, because I do feel like out of both of these AFC squads, it will be a little bit more embarrassing if Lamar Jackson wins his third MVP and still does not have a Super Bowl, unlike all the other multiple-time MVP winning quarterbacks in NFL history. But I do think that they are getting closer. It is a matter of a couple of pieces and a couple of adjustments on both sides of the football that I really think are needed for this Baltimore squad. So first and foremost, I feel like one area that kind of got papered over as the season went on was the protection for Lamar. The O-line early in the season had a lot of questions asked about it, a lot of movement along this line, whether it be guys like Patrick McCary and Ronnie Stanley moving inside or outside multiple times, or inconsistencies in pass protection when, they were a little bit more pass happy in certain games. I feel like that's paramount and integral to the offseason success of the Baltimore Ravens this particular year, because they feel closer than ever in terms of offensive game plan, because now they have more multiplicity to how they can approach it. Not only can Lamar threaten you downfield in the passing game with improved receiving play from both Flowers and Bateman for that matter, but he can also hand it off to a guy in Derrick Henry who's one of the best finishers in the game. But ultimately, if there are questions about your protection, chances are they're going to continue to be asked, and furthermore, continue to be asked until they're figured out. And so if you're Baltimore, you really need to hone in on what you need for this offensive line success for as long as Lamar's your QB, and most importantly, to get him over the hump to really be competing for Super Bowls and not just, AFC championship matchups. So that's one thing that they need to address. Most importantly, they need to address his blind side, because Ronnie Stanley, one of the most consistent left tackles, will start 103 games for the Ravens, is scheduled to be a free agent, and he is on the older side of things. He's a 30-year-old guy. I feel like that is pushing it a little bit in terms of offensive tackle age, but ultimately he has been one of the stalwarts of this line for years to come. But I do feel like if the Ravens do move on from him, there are many ways to address it. the free agency tackle class is highly superior to many others over the past couple of years, and you can find a couple good starters there. And then this draft class as well is very, very deep in terms of both tackle and guard positions. But ultimately, I feel like protecting Lamar's blind side is going to come down to whether or not they feel there's going to be even more movement next year amongst this line, or drafting a younger offensive tackle who will be a project at the position, might need to play multiple spots, given the inconsistencies overall of this line, is the better option at this point in time. But ultimately, I feel like no matter which position on the offensive line is called into question, whether or not it's Ronnie Stanley's or any other, I do feel like they need to address it somehow, some way, whether it be dipping into this free agent pool or drafting at that position and trying to have this young guy come in, potentially have to play multiple spots, because either one is a big risk, because Ronnie Stanley really has given you a lot of value over the past couple of years. So it's going to be hard for the Ravens to determine where they want to go with the future of this offensive line, but I guarantee you that I feel like a move is going to be made, especially at that left tackle spot. And then an under-the-radar one is the free safety spot, because I feel like Kyle Hamilton is still playing in this rover role, a very versatile free safety who can come down into the box and make run stuffs and also protect the linebackers a little bit in the run game as well. But I do feel like they need a more complete free safety who can lock down the back end of the secondary. I feel like, they have players in their roster that are capable of. Darius Washington stepped in admirably over the past couple of games and really was a big aspect of this defensive revamp in the last couple of weeks. But ultimately, they could add a free safety in free agency to really bolster that back end. Most importantly, continue to make Kyle Hamilton that much more versatile and free to do what he can in run support as well as passing game. Ultimately, it's more of a minor requirement for the Ravens because of the fact that Kyle Hamilton is so versatile and can be a difference maker in so many different ways for this defense, but it's still one to look out for if you're a Ravens fan. But now let's get into how they can view this Stanley situation. Because in this very deep talent pool of free agent offensive tackles, Stanley's signature is going to be very hard, and it's going to be very hard to re-sign as a result if you're Baltimore. I feel like because of this offensive tackle market especially, and the standard being set for a lot of these young guys in the league, getting $20 million or more per year, it's going to be very difficult for the Ravens to really determine whether or not Ronnie Stanley will remain that valuable for as long as they need him to. Because of the fact that, like I said, he's 30, and even though he's probably the best offensive lineman in this Ravens unit, I do think that getting younger could be on the back of their minds. And so, bolstering him or bolstering this offensive line could come at the detriment of him re-signing. But ultimately, I feel like this Ravens offensive line might need a little bit more of a younger bent to it. Because even though it's the more risky option, I feel like this is where you have to start being aggressive if you're Baltimore. Because, yes, Ronnie Stanley has served you for over 9 years. But ultimately, this offensive tackle class is very versatile, and you don't necessarily want to miss out on someone who can immediately be a difference maker, not just for playing one position, but multiple as well. Because that could be a big issue should Stanley leave and this Ravens line see inconsistency again. So dipping into this talent pool in the draft, I feel like, would be a wiser, more astute option for the Ravens than panicking in free agency. And in terms of the draft and where they're picking, they'll still have a lot of guys to look at if they want to go the route of drafting at OT. And Ariante Ursary is one of my favorite guys, kind of in that low round 1 grade in this offensive tackle class that they could be looking at. He has the power and physicality in the run game that I feel like he's going to appreciate Lamar and Derrick Henry for that matter, and ultimately very fluid in the pass game as well, should Lamar be more aggressive next year in the downfield passing game, much like he was this year. But ultimately, it's going to be down to how this whole situation with Ronnie Stanley pans out, because I could see him resigning, and I could see him giving them a couple more years of consistency at the left tackle spot. But I do think now is the time where I feel like the Ravens could get younger up front as well. And last but not least, in terms of a bold prediction for this Ravens team, going back to this defense, especially in that secondary, because the secondary was one of the units on the defensive side of the football coming into question a lot more often. I do feel like this free safety spot could allow Kyle Hamilton to be the ultimate wild card. If you get a guy, say, like Jeremy Chin, who's also very versatile in terms of how he plays the free safety spot and helps in run support, or a young guy like Trevon Merrick, who was doing incredible stuff with a very underrated Raiders defense, I feel like both of them will complement the best traits of Kyle Hamilton in terms of bolstering what he can do, as well as protecting the back end of the secondary, which was often called into question, especially those outside corners, Marlon Humphrey and Nate Wiggins, in terms of how they profile in the postseason. So getting a guy that can wear a number of hats in the secondary, especially at the free safety spot, could open up a lot more avenues for this defense down the line, and furthermore, bolster the Ravens' chances on both sides of the football to play complementary enough to beat teams like the Bills and Chiefs in the postseason. But let me know what you think about this Ravens quote-unquote semi-rebuild here, because they're an interesting team to analyze come postseason. But coming next, we take a look at some of the best players from the AFC in terms of their playoff performance. We're looking at specifically the offense. Let's talk about whether or not Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce have made this, or guys like Nico Collins, who's got underestimated in this postseason, have performed. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about the all-AFC playoff offense.
Looking for your